Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our fourth session. We've been gathering and connecting and saying hello to one another, as you can see from our chat window here tonight. And we're glad that you all are here. We're glad that you all are here, knowing that some folks are watching this live and others are seeing this as a recording. So we're, of course, now here on this fourth session of our 5-session series on Jim Wallace's book, America's Original Sin. And as we've been saying all along, no matter how you're participating, we're just glad that you're a part of the process as we seek to keep the conversation going. That's the theme. That's the theme for this process. It's been the theme for many other experiences that some wonderful leadership in our church has been putting together and offering to us. This is a part of that process. So we're appreciating the fact that you are a part of it, and that you're willing to be a part of this conversation as we learn together, in some ways struggle together, because learning always involves, I think, a rough edge that challenges us at points, pushes us, extends us. I mean, that's what learning is. That's what growing is. It's things that aren't a part of us now becoming a part of us. And so that process sometimes works very easily and is very calm and no tension involved other times. And I know you've all lived long enough to realize this. There can be a rough edge to that, and it can be disconcerting at times. But through the process, often it's the same outcome, that we become stronger, we become more faithful. I think in that way of thinking in faith, we become more and more who God creates us to be. So it's sort of a becoming process, and it's good to be on the journey together. So this chapter 4, much like some of the material that has come before it, this session 4, as we're dealing with chapters 7 and 8, is much like some of the other material in the book. There is, I think, a challenge to it. These are topics and issues that, as I've been saying repeatedly, have weight to them. When I say weight, for me, that means there's just a significance here. It's not something that you can approach lightly. It's not something that you can just, touch it and move on and not be concerned. It invites us to go deeper. That's, I think, what I mean when I say it has weight to it. It pushes beneath the surface of the way in which we often go about the business of our lives, even go about the business of our faith. So for those reasons, the ones I'm stating and many others that are left unstated here this evening, it is significant material, and I think for that reason it's not easy. Doesn't mean it's not important. It is vitally important, but let's be honest with one another. This is not an easy process. And I know we're even limited by this technological way of connecting, but as we also have been saying, this is better than not connecting at all. So we understand the limitations of this electronic medium, but we also recognize that God has a way of working in this process, in my life, in your life, in what we experience together, and brings us out on the other side, as I'm trying to put into words here tonight, in a more faithful place. So even though it's got some weight to it, it also brings life, and that is a good thing, and I want to celebrate that with you. So with that before us, I'd like to offer a prayer right away at the start of things here tonight, because I think prayer is one of the ways in which we are enabled to do what we're doing. So let's pray together and invite you to join me in the Spirit. O God, whose presence is ever shaping and extending our thoughts, our resolve, and our responses, be with us in our time of learning and conversation. In the midst of these issues, make your way clear and renew our spirits as we humbly serve you and your world. Amen. With that prayer before us, I'd like to then turn right to Scripture tonight. And so if you've got your Bible handy, you can grab it as you see me doing with mine. And we're going to turn to the Old Testament at first. And the reading comes out of one of the lesser prophets, lesser in the sense of smaller book, the smaller book, and not at all less important, but just referred to in the tradition of the scriptures as one of the lesser prophets. And this would be the book of Amos. So I want to turn to that right now and give you a moment to find it, first of all. It's kind of near the back of the Old Testament, so almost before you get to the New Testament. And it's one of those small little books there in the collection right before the New Testament begins. And I'd like to go into the book of Amos, and my reference is chapter 5. So chapter 5 in the book of Amos. And we're going to look at a couple of verses there in chapter 5, verses 23 and 24. Now keep in mind that these prophets not so much predicted the future, but were prophetic in the sense that they saw clearly, by way of God working in their lives, they saw clearly the situation of the moment. And they were able to name that and then call people to deeper faithfulness in the midst of whatever was going on. So I often remind myself of that, because when we say prophet or prophecy, we often think of foretelling the future. And that's not really what this is about. Oh, there's a future impact, but the word of the prophet, in the Old Testament at least, is almost always connected to the present reality. So that's what Amos is looking at. And look what he says, the voice of God speaking through him. Verse 23 and 24 in chapter 5, he says, "Take away from me," so the prophet's speaking on behalf of God, "take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Those couple of verses capture this larger theme in Amos, which is identifying what's perceived to be unfaithfulness, and basically saying, hey, the worship life, the traditions, the practices of ritual, the sacrifices that you make in the temple in my presence, God is saying, none of that means anything unless you allow justice and mercy to flow. So the word of God through the prophet here is identifying the fact that a religious-looking life or religious-looking practices are really nothing but just the thinness of, a leaf that's blown away in the wind. And what God desires is this deep, rolling reality, pouring out like water, rolling down like waters. If you think of a powerful waterfall, that the power of that and the presence of it that can't be denied, that's what matters, God says. And that's what we're called to be a part of, this justice, this mercy. And if we're not, then the word of the prophet is we're missing something. So I wanted to lift that up as a kind of a touchstone for our reflection tonight. Added to that, since we're right here in these last books of the Old Testament, go a little closer now to the New Testament, into the book of Micah. It's just a few pages over. You kind of go through the book of Jonah quickly, and then you're going to hit the book of Micah. And go in Micah to chapter 4. So again, Old Testament, the end of the Old Testament, book of Micah, chapter 4. And I want to read, picking up with verse 2, and read a few verses here. This is more in the style of poetry that we're used to from the prophets. And I'm going to pick it up just, the second line or so of verse 2. And if you want to follow along with me, this is what the prophet says, again, speaking for God. "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall arbitrate between strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. And nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war any more, but they shall all sit under their own vines and under their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. For all the peoples walk, each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. So Micah creating this vision, again aware of what's happening in the moment, but also capturing the fact that God can create something new, and that newness will be the peoples of the world not being at war, not struggling with one another, not fighting against one another, but being at peace with one another. And they are at peace because they are following in the way of God. And I think, too, that's a part of our call. In the midst of the tension of these issues and all of the struggle and the strife that often appropriately is wrapped around the process, the goal is to come out peacefully, to come out in relationship with one another, or as we'll learn a little bit later in our conversation tonight, to be in community with one another. Okay, well, that's enough commentary. Just things that I thinking about and trying to put together in my own mind. Those passages are ones that I was starting to reflect on and wanted to lift them up for you. Just that call of God, that prophetic word that says, this is what's happening, but this is what is possible when God is with us. All right, so justice. That's what Amos says. It needs to be pouring out like the waters, rolling down upon us justice. Now, I want to ask you a question, and please respond as you have been doing throughout our sessions and doing such a marvelous job with that. And the question is, I'm even going to write it down here and post it out there. What do you think of, or what comes to mind with hearing the word justice? So I'm just interested in what comes to your mind. What's some of the first reaction you have to that word? What thoughts does it bring? What feelings does it bring? Do you have a way of expressing what that means? What is justice? Particularly when you just hear that word kind of dangling out there on its own. As you're giving that some consideration, let me share some things that I was thinking about just to kind of get us started. One of the first words that I noted was the word, there it is, Linda, I was just going to say it, fairness. And there it is, Nicole, fairness. So interesting, that's the first word that came to my mind too. It's fairness. It's a sense of equality. It's a sense of that no one is treated differently than another. In that sense, a fairness. It's not necessarily what happens is fair, although I think that can be part of it, but it's that whatever happens to all. So there's that sense of justice. So, yeah, but there might be some other thoughts or words that come to mind. I've got a couple other things that I noted. Tim says, or Joan says rather, the equality of judgment. So there's that word of keeping things balanced. Brian chimes in with that, the equalizing factor. We're all on the same plane. We are in the same situation. Faith says each person receiving what he or she needs to thrive. So in that sense, justice provides a result or an outcome, and faith is saying it's life, right? It's life-giving. That's what I think of when I hear thrive, faith. And Kathy says equitable solutions for all parties involved in a dispute. So it doesn't mean there's not dispute. It doesn't mean there's not struggle. It doesn't mean there's not differences among us. It means that in the midst of that, there's a process of justice that brings an outcome that is equitable there. Brett says, same treatment. So again, it doesn't imply there isn't any treatment or there's no consequence. It just means it's going to be consistent, one to the other. Okay? Yeah. So that's different than how justice sometimes is both applied, experienced, and understood in our culture, right? And we're learning that. I know we've learned that in other ways and in other places, but it's being affirmed again through Wallace's book, that just because we say a system, for instance, the criminal justice system, uses that word in its description, it does not necessarily imply or mean then that that justice is going to look like the things that we were just noting. Because sometimes in our world, and I might even say often in our world, justice has a connotation of retribution, of making things equal in the sense of we're going to get even. You know, that Old Testament view of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That if you hurt me, then I get to hurt you. And that's what makes it fair and equitable. So that notion of justice, kind of evening the score, or making sure that, you know, I can walk away sensing some win in this game, is often the reality of what we refer to as justice. And I'm not sure, in fact, I am sure, that really doesn't match up with the kind of biblical justice that the prophets are speaking about and that we lift up often when we think about faith and what justice and mercy mean in that context. It's more along the lines of what we were just identifying. A consistency, you know, an equality, even a unity of experience and result. And so the criminal justice system particularly, has some issues, and that's why we're in this conversation together. Sandy says restorative justice, and I'm going to say thank you for that, and I'm also going to say let's push a pause on that, because we'll come to that, I think, as we get later into our session tonight. But it has everything to do, Sandy, with what you're saying there about living into God's image for us and what God intends. And so, and Jerry adds, of course, if you want peace, you have to work for justice. Justice in this sense that we are talking about, the fairness and consistency and equality among us all. Okay. One of the authors that Jim Wallace refers to is Brian Stevenson. And I know many of you know this book written by Brian Stevenson called Just Mercy. We've done different studies on this book in the past couple of years. And if you haven't read this book, I would highly recommend it as a complement to Wallace's book. In some ways, it's more accessible, I think, because it's narrative in its style. Brian Stevenson tells stories of his own experience, and he's a lawyer, and he has now lived his life calling to assist those who are poor and who are wrongly accused, and tries to find justice for them. Particularly, one of the emphasis for him and the organization that he has founded is those who are condemned to death, and particularly those who are wrongly condemned to death, and working to turn their cases around and overturn their convictions. And he's had great success with that. So a pretty remarkable person. And I wanted to read just briefly from some of his opening material. I think it's actually the introduction to the book. And let me just give you a flavor of what Brian Stevenson is saying about these kinds of matters that are before us tonight. He says, this book is about getting closer to mass incarceration and extreme punishment in America. It is about how easily we condemn people in this country and the injustice we create when we allow fear, anger, and distance to shape the way we treat the most vulnerable among us. He goes on to write, hundreds of thousands of nonviolent offenders have been forced to spend decades in prison. We've created laws that make writing a bad check or committing a petty theft or minor property crime of offense that can be then a result of life imprisonment. We have declared a costly war on people with substance abuse problems. And then he writes, we've given up on rehabilitation, education, and services for the imprisoned because providing assistance to the incarcerated is apparently too kind and compassionate. So, and he goes on, of course, to tell his own personal story about all of that. So that's, a very eloquent way of saying what I was trying to say before, that just because a system says this is the criminal justice system, within that system can certainly be injustices, and he names just a few there, and of course we're aware that there are many, many others. So what do we do with that? Well, I wanted to turn to our first video clip tonight, and I have several to share. And this first one is helping us to understand that our criminal justice system, and even more specifically policing, which, as you know, if you've read chapter 7, is the focus of that chapter, has at its root the connection to slavery and some of the intense bigotry and racism that were a part of our nation's history. So I don't want to say too much more except to show the clip. And this, I believe, is the clip that I grabbed from a television station in Orlando, Florida. And so you could do what I've been doing, which is simply Googling these topics and click videos, and there's all kind of videos that come up. And I've just been selecting ones that spoke to me that I thought you might appreciate in the course of our study here. But you could do the same thing and further your own learning or experience. I'm finding that videos, more so even than written articles, have a way of communicating, particularly on this issue, in ways that are helpful. So with no more commentary, again from me, let me turn to the video. You want to have your sound up, of course, and then we'll come back and keep the conversation going. So take a look.
Put your hands on the car, I'm gonna shoot you in your head. You understand me?
The toxic relationship very often between law enforcement and communities of color have existed for hundreds of years.
Leroy Purnell is an award-winning and nationally recognized professor at FAMU Law, having served as dean twice. His knowledge of the judicial system and policing runs deep.
Even the origin of police forces themselves has roots in slavery.
To protect and serve, that's the modern phrase most of us associate with police officers. But in the South, before the Civil War, slave patrols were law enforcement. They protected property, that property being slaves.
There's a history of law enforcement participating in acts of anti-Black violence. This goes back to the era of slave patrols, and anytime an African-American escaped from his or her captor or slave owner, there were bounties offered to individuals who might be marshals, they might be deputized.
They would hunt down and capture runaway slaves, enact their own form of brutal punishment, and then return those broken Black men and women to their owners for another round of physical or disfiguring abuse. When slavery was abolished in 1865, slave patrols transformed into something else.
In Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction eras, law enforcement often played a participatory and sometimes leading role in lynchings.
After Reconstruction ended in 1877 came Jim Crow laws that created apartheid in the United States.
Negro Day, when the colored youth of Florida display their athletic and cultural achievements.
The segregation of schools and restaurants, whites-only bathrooms and water fountains, black people forced to the back of the bus. Who enforced those laws? The police. And history shows they did more than that.
Law enforcement either did little or actually participated in various forms of anti-black lynchings and also mass murders against African Americans. That record is undeniable. The people who led the Klan during the first, over half century of its existence were business leaders. They were mayors. They were sheriffs. Many leaders of the Klan were in fact connected to law enforcement.
This is what historians will tell you set the tone for what is still happening today. It's only been 56 years since the end of Jim Crow and the signing of the Civil Rights Act. Racism and injustice are still woven into law enforcement agencies.
All right, I realize and I apologize. I should have given that kind of warning heading into that some of the language and images were going to be possibly disturbing, so I do apologize for that. I didn't mean to just lay that on you that way. And there are some disturbing images, but let's face it, they reflect a very disturbing aspect of the history of our country. And that's, partly what we're trying to be open about and deal with, head on through this process. So, as I mentioned, and as you well know, the focus of this chapter 7 particularly is policing, and I wanted to know what, again, kind of in that idea of the thing that comes to your mind or the feelings that are conjured up in you when you think police. And I realize for some of us that may not be the easiest of questions, because perhaps that response, your response has shifted or does shift depending upon the realities of what's happening in the world at the moment. I know for much of my life, and even honestly now in my life, when I think police, I think of safety, those who are called upon, given the responsibility to provide safety. So I have, I think, for a lot of my life, connected those two thoughts, police and safety. What about for you? Is there a word or thought or feeling that comes to mind? And let me also say, this is a tough part of this conversation, I think, for many. And we're going to talk about that too in a minute. Individuals with a difficult job. So Kathy, I think, identifies what many of us feel, that it's not an easy job. It's not an easy calling. Alyssa says community helpers. Karen says enforcers of the law. Linda says thinks of safety along with me. Brett says responsible for public order. So keeping things orderly and within the boundaries that make society function, right? Kay says help those who come to help. So I think it's for many of us, particularly those of us who are white and a part of the majority culture, we've grown up with that sense that the police are our friends. They are there to help. They are there to assist. They are there to protect. They are there to keep safety and order in our lives. Brian says what is the obvious thing, and we appreciate that it does depend. And we know very well, because we're in the midst of our conversation, as we keep it going, that the things we're saying and that you're identifying with me are not always what comes to mind. Carol says, wonder what's happening. So sometimes the police are there and like, what trouble is erupting, or what's going to be happening? How's it going to impact what's happening to me? Tim says there's danger in their job, certainly. And Katya says, think of the word police, thinks of something wrong is going on. So they're necessary, and yet it also means there may be trouble. And Sandy says not only as people, but as an action. So it's the policing. And that may be part of it. I appreciate that nuance there, Sandy, that it's the action of policing that is sadly something that makes the news in the negative, often violent and unjust way in which we see it happening. Now, that's not categorically true everywhere. It's not. This is not across the board. I think it's really important to make that point, that we are not saying all police or all policing has those aspects, but we certainly know from events that have happened recently in our own country, in our own city, that there are those occasions when the policing action brings tragic results. And what we are, I think, able to say in this context is that there is a racism element to that sometimes is buried. It's often not acknowledged. It is, very possibly even not, we're not aware of it, but it's there. And part of Jim Wallace's task, I think, is to help us to see that. Katya says the word policing does not have a positive connotation. So when you move from police to policing, it starts to change in the feel of it. Faith says people who, like me, these are about police, were raised to believe black people are inherently dangerous and need to be policed. So again, that's that racism, both implicit and explicit. We learned about that in an earlier chapter. And identifying the fact that there's some built-in bias that kind of puts us on guard and makes us ready to respond. So Wallace talks about all of this, and that's what was noted there in the video clip, that the roots of that go back to slavery. I never thought about it this way. For me, this was a new thought, helpful, challenging, sad, but helpful, that the policing, particularly in the Deep South, around both slavery and then later in our lifetimes, in the tension around racial injustice in the South, had its roots in policing. The police's job were to keep slaves in their place and to find them when they escaped and to bring them back and to face punishment. And that was the act of policing. And in some ways, that has not left us. And that's part of the challenge of where we are and what's going on in our world. So one of the things that I've also found helpful in the chapter, difficult as it was, is that, and thanks Sandy for that, you can keep putting comments, so you don't have to wait on me. But I may not be able to acknowledge every single one, but Sandy, I do see your comment there, so thank you for sharing that. And your caption of some of that history that we're talking about. So one of the things I found helpful in the material was the authors talking about the movement of the Black Lives Matter, and then he named how blue lives also matter. So in the book, I just thought that was a good point, and I had not really put those thoughts together in my own mind. So on page 136 and 137 of the book, I'll give you a minute to turn there with me. If you look at the bottom of page 136, it says, "So it's important to acknowledge legitimate grievances and protests directed toward our broken law enforcement system, while, this is the key, while also recognizing that police do a very dangerous and stressful job in trying to protect our communities. Black lives matter, and blue lives matter too. It's precisely because we want police to behave like guardians and not soldiers that we should want our law enforcement officers to feel as safe and supported as possible." He has, in the earlier pages here, talked about that difference between being a warrior or being a guardian. And I want to come back to that in just a moment. But here, as he talks about it, he acknowledges and affirms that blue lives matter. I was thinking about this. In fact, let me see what my reference is. Yes, in the Bible, I won't turn to it. I'll just give it to you. It's just a one little verse. It's in Matthew chapter 19, verse 14. You can check it out later. Jesus is there, and there are children around, and Jesus says to the disciples and to others, "Let the little children come to me, for to them belongs the kingdom of heaven." That's in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19. Let the little children come to me, for to them belongs the kingdom of heaven. When Jesus says that, he is not saying that let the children come to me, the kingdom belongs to them, implying that the kingdom doesn't belong to anybody else. Jesus specifically mentions those in that culture that were pushed out, ignored, who were seen to be unseen. In other words, not even people. And Jesus says, let them come to me, for to them belongs the kingdom of heaven. It's Jesus' way of saying, as he lifts out the children in that culture, that God cares about them. He does not imply, as he says, let the children come, that no one else should. So that's one of the things in this whole argument about Black Lives Matter, when people are so upset about that frustrates me. Because just because we say a particular group is deserving of honor, respect, and our recognition, that does not then imply that everyone else doesn't matter. Right? And so there are times and places, and I believe this is one of those in our life together, when it is important to say about a community of people that has in so many ways been pushed down or pushed out or left behind, that they matter. And that's a way of claiming or reclaiming or affirming their place and the honor and respect that is deserved. It does not imply that we therefore disregard everyone or everything else. So I've thought about that scene with Jesus many times. Let the children come to me, to them belong the kingdom. And we know that Jesus is not excluding anyone as he says that. And so same for us. When we say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean we're excluding others. But I particularly like how Jim Wallace then adds in the course of this discussion that blue lives matter too. So, now, I mentioned earlier in the book, he talks about this difference between guardian and warrior. And I wondered if in your own words you could share some of what you were hearing him say the difference is between the guardian, the police as the guardian, and the difference between guardian and warrior. What does that notion of police as guardian offer? What does it bring? What does it make possible that is not possible when we think of the police as the warriors or the soldiers of society? Anybody have some thoughts about that? I'm not even sure I actually put that down in my notes. I'm looking down to see if I had given any thought to that ahead of time, and I think I did, but I can't find my note on it. So maybe you can help me out with that, because he takes some time in the book to talk about the differences here. What does he mean, or what do we think is meant when we think of police as guardian? I know one of the things that has come to my mind that I know I put down in a note somewhere is that sense of mutuality, that a guardian cares about me, cares about the other, is guarding the respect and honor of all people. That there's a guard, there's a protection there that's much different than we think of as, violent reaction. So let's see what we've got from some of you. Linda says a protector versus antagonist. So again, that protecting element as opposed to one who's stirring up the issue. Brett says a guardian doesn't shoot first and ask questions later. Yeah. Karen says protecting and watching over all. So that, again, that it almost sounds like compassion, almost sounds like mercy when you think about it that way. Janine says a guardian makes me think of a shepherd protecting us, and a warrior implies violence. Absolutely. Almost antithetical to one another. guardian and warrior. Alyssa says, a guardian keeper of people and safety, a warrior, physical. I think of a gladiator, ready for battle, right? Ready for battle. Brian says, I think the difference comes down to an issue of control. So a guardian, the motivation of a guardian is not to control. In many ways, a guardian is there to enhance and to keep in place the shared control of the community, to guard that, so that no one or no thing becomes oppressor or over and above, right? The guardian maintains that peace. And Brian is saying that, I think you're implying, that the warrior wants to have power over. And in a sense, there's that winning and losing element to I think that warrior mentality. Yeah. Doug says, to me, the guardian implies a protector and a de-escalator, and the warrior implies an inflictor and one who escalates. So again, guardian defusing and warrior infusing, just to use some of your thought there, Doug, about the difference between the two. So what Wallace is getting at here is to say that part of the process we should be involved in, that we should care about, is not doing away with policing, but working with police and insisting really that those who are involved in the policing of our communities are in this guardian mentality as opposed to warrior. And I thought that was helpful to think about the difference of those two ways. Brett says that we can create and train soldiers, and we should be able to create and train guardians. Yeah, we should be able to. I think there's some evidence that it can be done. We'll talk about that just in a moment. Guardians appear to protect others. Warriors seem to fight, and not necessarily for others, but simply just to fight. Maybe sometimes just for the sake of fighting, right? Now, let's also acknowledge that there are situations in which police find themselves where responding with force is the only thing they can do for their own protection and for the protection of others. So we clearly recognize, I would think, that there are those situations. The problem is in the discernment, the judgment that's applied to when that situation warrants the force. I don't think a guardian is ever meant to say, I will not, express force here. I will not show force. A guardian may do that. It's the motivation that really is the key. There's sort of a philosophical reality that shifts us from one place to the other, from warrior to guardian. In the book, Jim Wallace introduces us, if it's new to you, to the idea of community policing. And so I want to turn to my next video clip, which touches on this and gives us some experiences of what it means to do community policing. Now, one of the things I recognize is that in his book, there's a lot of statistics, and I think that's kind of his thing. And I know that can be helpful, and I want to say another word about statistics a little bit later on, but it can make for sort of dry reading. This next video I like because it tells a story, and it's expressing what it means to live into this idea of community policing. So let me go to it, and then we'll come right back and, of course, pick up the conversation.
There always has been and there always will be a mistrust of police from certain segments of every community. Police officers got to think deeper. They got to be community-minded. They have to want more than, I'm going to go out and save the world as Superman, the police officer.
One of my goals was to shrink the area, get everybody to know each other. You know who lives next door to you. I think crime is less likely to occur that way.
Email basically read, it's called the Rock House Program. Police officers are going to live in a high crime area, be the face of your community. People are going to know where you live and have your phone number.
In terms of engaging the community and being responsive to community concerns, community policing is among the best tools police departments have to respond to the political crisis.
When you see there is that mistrust, you need to attack it head on. The ROC program is a critical piece of community policing.
We just turned into my area, just so you know. That street back there, Auburn Street, that's my southern border, but I go Auburn Street up to Glenwood. This is Rockton that we're on. I go from Rockton over to Huffman. So this is my area. She's just a brat. She's a good dog. She's a brat. Come here. Why didn't you want to go pee over there, huh? You go on the sidewalk, but you don't want to go in the bathroom that I dug out for you.
The Rock House program, it's a resident officer program, if you will, for the city of Rockford. The crux of the program is an officer living in a neighborhood, being a neighbor, being a friend, being an average person, and building relationships with the community.
I talked to my daughter about it, and she wasn't interested at first because we were downsizing big time. She actually got tears in her eyes and said, "You're taking steps backwards in life, hon."
Believe it or not, a lot of officers didn't want any part of it. Some people have families, they kind of just want to get away from police stuff when they go home. I feel like me being young and single, and I like the kind of community-oriented policing anyway, so it just kind of just made sense.
Starting in the early 1980s, community policing began to spread in a serious way to American cities and began to become adopted very widely. In the 90s, the Clinton administration started giving police departments money to hire police officers.
Today, I'm pleased to announce that we are going to help New York City hire and deploy 1,600 more community police officers.
Many police departments got millions of dollars to hire community officers. Then comes the great fiscal crisis that struck the country in 2007, 2008. Police departments began to cut back.
Over the past few weeks, many Americans have felt anxiety about their finances and their future.
Important aspects of their community policing programs were one of the victims of the cutback. And you saw this in city after city. Now cities have begun to come back, and they're looking again to find ways to reinvigorate the city's community policing program. I think the lesson here is that budgets matter, money counts, but police chiefs and politicians know that this is what the public expects. In important ways, it's also a response to the legitimacy crisis, where it was helpful to mobilize people around crime in the 80s and 90s. Now it's trying to reestablish the connection between police and the public. But police officers, in my experience, like to maintain some anonymity, some distance from the places where they work. In particular, police officers who sometimes have to make hard decisions about what they're going to do and how they're going to have to deal with people.
I've been born and raised here. So a lot of times I do have to arrest people that I know people who love them, who care about them. You know, sometimes I'll be like, damn, man, why you make me do that?
The old days of cuff them and stuff them, if you will, it didn't work. We just put more people in prison for a lot of offenses that prison wasn't going to solve. We still have to go to calls. We still have to go to violent crimes. We still have to deal with law enforcement. The other 60, 70, 80% of your time, how can I solve problems or mitigate problems so they don't become problems? We're not always successful, but there's different ways to attack the problem.
The thing about community policing is that it focuses on problems, not crime.
How you guys doing? Y'all cold?
The effective programs find ways of mobilizing city resources to address a really wide range of problems. Thank you, Ms. Turner.
You're welcome.
And this is a tremendous change in what police see themselves as responsible for.
The reason I keep a lot of toys and blankets, hats, gloves, it's just, just better community interaction. Oftentimes when people have a run-in with the police, it's not good. So I just want to just change that and show them that we want to be their friends. We don't want to just be somebody that's coming there when someone calls 911 and takes somebody to jail.
Being a Rock House officer is non-traditional policing for today's police. But when you think back, people probably lived right next door to the sheriff or right next door to their officer. So this is probably really what traditional policing was supposed to be. We just somehow moved away from it.
You can't really determine we stopped a crime from occurring or we stopped a gang member from moving into a neighborhood because of the officers there. But an easy way to gauge the success of the program, go knock on their neighbors' doors. It's hard to measure happiness, but you can measure when people tell you, I absolutely love the fact that the police live here. That's a good measurement. The end goal is to make that community, that particular neighborhood, self-sustaining and have a trust with the police, not just that officer, but the police in general.
Police work is people work. It's as people-oriented as being a school teacher. And police officers who think that they have the support of the community in which they work, they're much more willing to grant them some respect. They're much more willing to explain to them the reasons why they're taking the actions that they are. So the police sense of solidarity with the place in which they work is important.
When I listen to my parents, my grandparents talk, and they talk about how they could name every person in every house all the way down the block for several blocks, you know. But now if you ask the average person who lives 2 houses away from you, they have no clue. Having an officer living right there in your neighborhood, you know, you see that they're just a regular person. Of course you should live where you patrol. You know, you will have a greater sense of empathy if you do. Because not only are you working there, but hey, those are your neighbors.
All right. So I posted a question here toward the last part of that video, and picking up from what we had heard or shared with one another earlier around the word policing and the reaction that sometimes we have emotionally to that word. And so I thought about this question as I was watching that video with you, and that is what can change, or what's the potential change in how we either react to the word policing or the way that we think that policing can take place when we connect that word with the word community. You know, what's different about it? And so Annette says a neighbor watching over us. So it becomes somebody we know. It becomes, if not a friend, at least someone who knows us, we know them, maybe by name, or at least we have a very strong connection in the reality of where we live. So there's a proximity with community policing that may not exist otherwise. Yeah. Doug says a shared responsibility. If it's our community, then we care about that together, right? Sandy says not only watching over us, but helping us to watch over and care for each other, creating that environment where mutual care, that's the word that keeps coming up in my mind, is the mutuality of what's happening here. The bad things affect us all. The good things also impact all of us in positive ways. Karen says partnering with those in the community, so creating that relationships, some of what we were just talking about. Brett says provides comfort, builds trust. Linda says someone with an interest in everybody else's success. So those pieces then that make something come alive that wouldn't be possible otherwise if police are only there to, tamp down or control or remove from the scene, that kind of motivation. With those things pushed to the side, we've got these other things that are possible. Linda says someone with an interest in everybody succeeding. Yeah. And Bev says police work is people work. So yeah, this is about people we're talking about. And police are people too, aren't they? Yeah. Tim says a network of resources that are available so those police officers can become sources of encouragement, learning, and teaching. Social services, counseling, and so on. Kathy says not always a negative action, but includes positive activity. So there's this engagement, I think, from a community policing standpoint that often is not there. Now, this is not a brand new concept. There's been some fresh new talk about it, in response to the issues and problems and the abuses that we see currently. But this community policing idea has been around for a while. One of the issues that I've learned as I've read and checked out a little bit more information that make it difficult is that it is a philosophy where much of policing depends upon procedures. The consistency of policing is this is the law, this is what happens when you break the law, and in that way the sense of justice then becomes consistent in that this happens and therefore this will happen. And there's that regiment of approach in policing. Community policing is much more an art, if you will, responding in the moment. What this particular situation calls for may be different than this situation, even though the actions may be very similar. The people involved, the context that surrounds that situation, all of that is taken into account, and it becomes a responding to that situation what is best and most helpful and has the greatest degree of success or outcome. And many who are involved in policing, are not as comfortable with that sort of open-ended process, And so that's one of the things that has made it difficult, and I think has prevented it from taking hold in some areas. But the communities that have truly embraced it, and there have been many, some of them large cities, others small community towns, have seen dramatic positive results. And so I think for that reason, it's certainly worth continuing to talk about and to lift up. Now, all of that is good. And yet, Jim Wallace goes into chapter 8 saying it doesn't mean that we have made it. In fact, we got a long way to go. And part of his critique is toward us, who are the church, people of faith, and what our response is to all of this. If community is the key, where are we in that process of building community, of guarding community, of enhancing community? And so there's a real challenge there. So I want to go to my third clip, which we'll take just a little time after to share reaction to it. This is a preacher, and he's had a past that has definitely impacted who he has become. And by the way, Janine, thank you. I saw your comments earlier about riding bikes and riding horses, and I think you're right that instead of the military-like vehicle, to have that very personal, almost a feeling of vulnerability in the police, even though they have a firearm and other protection perhaps. Their presence, when it's more human, I think, creates some of what you're talking about here. And you mentioned that even in the Columbus Dispatch, there were some recent articles about this whole notion. So thank you for that point. But I was getting ready to say, as I'm setting up this third clip, let's just watch it, and then we'll respond to it together. So here it is, and we'll be right back.
I don't come to this issue from the perspective of someone who is concerned about mass incarceration because I see it every day, even though I am. I don't come to this perspective from the position of someone who, as a black man, is concerned about Black America, even though I am. I don't come to this from the perspective of a father who has a young daughter who's going to have children who have a greater possibility of going to prison than their white or Latino counterparts. But I am. I come to this perspective from somebody who was one of the 1 in 15. I come to this perspective from someone, and I didn't go to jail for a white collar crime. I didn't go to jail for having too many beers to get behind the wheel of a car. My crime of commitment was attempted murder in the second degree. And I served 9 years in New York State prisons. Went to jail with the GED. I went to jail without faith. I was a self-proclaimed atheist agnostic. And the first time that I got down on my knees to pray was at 26 years of age on February 5th, 1990, in the 34th precinct in Upper Manhattan, the same precinct that the police officers came from the day that Malcolm X was killed. And I got down on my knees in that precinct and I said, God, I don't know what your name is. I don't know what to call you, Allah or Jesus, or I don't know, but all I know is I need help. And I heard a voice in the back of my mind say, the truth will make you free. And I said, boy, those are some real good drugs I had, because the truth is going to get me 25 to life. But I confessed that day, and it was the first time that I took responsibility for my own actions as an adult. And I went to jail. 16 months on Rikers Island, the biggest prison industrial complex in the world, the biggest jail in the world. 16 months. I watched the worst of man's inhumanity to man. I watched two men hold a man down and attempt to play tic-tac-toe in his face with a razor. I saw people get busted in the head with a metal mountain ring over a cigarette. I fought for my life for 16 months. When I went to jail, my daughter was 3 months old. And by the time I came out, it was 2 weeks before her 9th birthday. But I stand here today telling you that prison didn't break me, it made me. And I went to jail a boy and I came out a man. And I'm not breaking my arm, patting myself on the back. I'm telling you that there are hundreds of thousands of other nameless, faceless men like me who've gone through the prison industrial complex and have come out on the other side knowing that they can't just go back to their community and act like it's business as usual. We have to go back to the community and talk to the young men there and tell them that there's another way, that there's something else that they could do, and let people know, like you good folks, that it's not good enough to come to church on Sunday and lift up our hands and throw back our heads and open up our mouths and praise God through a illegitimate child that came down through 42 generations that included a whore and a murderer and all kinds of other folks and a man who was a victim of capital punishment. And we praise this same God every Sunday, but yet and still we won't do anything for these boys in our community that are going to jail in record numbers. And the question becomes of us now, what are you going to do? What are you willing to do? Are you willing to fight? Are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? Are you willing to open up your mouth? Are you willing to raise your hands, not just to praise God, but to help somebody, but to reach out to somebody, to let them know that there's somebody more? Let me just say this and I'm gonna stop. Listen, man, the folk who I was in prison with and the folks who came to prison, the good folk, when I was in Sing Sing, they had 5 groups that came in every month. The first Sunday was the Crusaders. The second Sunday was the Pentecostal Crusader. Third Sunday was Bible Way Church. 5th Sunday was Pals for Christ, and 4th Sunday was Hepzibah House, affectionately known by the men in Sing Sing as the white folks. And nobody went to church when the white folks came in because they sang boring hymns that nobody knew, and they sang the songs about royal diadems, and nobody knew what in the ham grits a royal diadem was, so nobody wanted to come to church. But I served with them every Sunday as the chaplain's assistant. I got saved on Rikers Island, and I preached my first sermon in Sing Sing Correctional Facility. I went to seminary, New York Theological Seminary in Sing Sing. And when I made parole in August of 1998, I went to the Crusaders, who were from Harlem, where I'm from. And I said, hey, I'm going home. And they were like, good luck with that. And I went to the Pentecostal Crusaders, and I said, well, I could travel to Brooklyn. That's all right. And I said, hey, I'm going home. And they said, we'll pray for you. And I went to Bible Way Church, who was from Ossining, where the jail was. And I said to them, I'm going home. They said, we wish you lived closer. And I went to Pals for Christ, and Chuck was 90-something years old. There was nothing he could do. But when I went to the folk from Hepzibah House, they said, what would you have us to do? And they put their arms around me. And when I came home, they brought me to their church, and they brought me to their home, and they sat me with their families, and we had a meal together. And that began to give me the glimmer of hope that all white folks weren't correction officers and all white folks weren't bad at all. And then I got to meet great folks in Sing Sing like Jim Wallace. I met Jim Wallace in Sing Sing. And I need you to understand that these folks, they embraced me, they put their arms around me. And when my wife, the woman who stood with me for those 9 years when I was in prison, when she passed away from cancer in 2002, those same folk from Hepzibah House, the white folks, the royal diadem folk, called the funeral home and they paid for my wife's entire funeral service. And when they came to the funeral service where I served the youth minister at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, I told them, you walk in with the family because you are my family. So I'm saying to you today, yeah, there's racism. Yeah, there's problems. Yeah, there's issues. Yes, there's legislation and there's grassroots things that we must address and we must do. But the first thing that we must address is the human element of humanizing men and women who will be suffering for the rest of their lives for one mistake. Who will be suffering for the rest of their lives because they had no other recourse, because they knew no better, they saw no better, they experienced no better, so they did no better. They won't do better until we teach them better, until we show them better, until we love them better, until we preach for them better, until we understand them better, until we understand that today is the day that we have to say, this must come to an end. It's our job. It's no one else's job. If you call yourself a Christian, read Matthew 25:31-46. And if you still choose to sit on your behind, burn the Bible, stop going to church, and stop calling yourself a Christian. Because we can't serve a man and we can't talk about a man who is a victim of capital punishment unless we do something about all forms of punishment to make them humane, to make them right, and to solve this problem in our country today. Amen.
Okay. Yeah. Read Matthew chapter 25. And of course, that's the teaching about Jesus saying, he was in prison and no one came. And when you do it to the least of these, you do it to him. And of course, the other part is true too. When you visit, when you care, when you show compassion, Jesus says in that teaching, you do it to him, that he is in solidarity with those who are hurting. And specifically in this regard, those who are in prison. So, challenging. And when I came across that video, I watched it several times. And, there's that word of, there's kind of that old-fashioned way of saying, I really feel convicted. and not to make any pun on punitive language, but I felt that, we all, in ways I'm sure that we can acknowledge and in other ways that we would never want to acknowledge, do far less than what we should or what we can in response to these issues. I was particularly struck when Pastor Ferguson said the thing we are called to do is to focus on the human element. And I think in Wallace's way, that's what he is trying to do. I see you asking about the video. I will include, and I meant to actually put in the description box of the webcast tonight where the links are for these videos. And I'll get those to you so you can see the page where I found them. But again, if you Google, these things, you'll come across the same kinds of things. Oh yeah, Alyssa, you're right. He does put this same video in the book on page 130, so thank you for that. And I found it in the platform called Vimeo, Vimeo, one of their videos there. So, but turn with me in the book to 165, page 165. Sandy earlier, I think it was Deacon Sandy, that said something about restorative justice or restorative justice. And I said we'd come back to that, and I wanted to here because it's at the close of chapter 8. And I thought in 165 there was a helpful summary through these bullet points of the difference between criminal justice, as we traditionally think of it, and then this restorative justice and the differences between them. And note with me really that last bullet point, the central focus of criminal justice, it says, are offenders getting what they deserve. The sense that justice is punitive. That this is how we will even the score and lay down the sentence to make that possible. The central focus of restorative justice, first of all, are the victim's needs, and then what the offender's responsibility is in repairing the harm, in making things right. So it doesn't pretend away what's taken place, but it involves both the one hurt and the one who's done the hurting in the process of the healing. In other words, it creates relationship. And, I think that holds so much potential for us and for our world and for we who are in the church. I wanted to close our time by having us reflect on something that our congregation is involved in, and that is the letter writing called Hope Letters.